This talk will cover the history of the construction of the canal, its current usage, and recent developments. The original idea of constructing a canal is attributed to Charles I of Spain, who in 1534 made this proposal because he appreciated that all the ships that were in the Pacific would have to be offloaded and all the goods taken across the isthmus and then reloaded onto the fleet that would sail back to Spain every year. Although he made this proposal, nothing came of it. Of course, the situation was made worse in a way by as you can see, the main area of Spanish colonization at this time was on the west coast, particularly in Peru. And the situation was made more important in a way after Magellan had discovered the Philippines and claimed the Spanish crown. And this led to the development of the so-called Manila Fleet, which would sail every year across the Pacific to the west coast of Central America. Again, everything would have to be offloaded and then reloaded on the Caribbean side. The next historical figure who proposed a canal was Simon Bolivar, who was the leader of the opposition to Spanish colonial authority in South America in the early 1800s. But again, nothing more came of his proposal. The first person who really got down to it was Ferdinand de Lesseps, who, of course, had made a lot of money and been very successful as a result of his construction of the Suez Canal. And this had made a lot of money not only for him but for for French investors. And so he then got the idea of building a canal in Panama, which was a much more difficult proposition than building the Suez Canal, although in fact the Suez Canal is longer than the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal, of course, represented a considerable challenge because of the tropical conditions prevailing in Panama and the probable requirement to build locks. Suez, of course, is a sea level canal, but the height of the countryside through which the canal would have to be built in Panama would almost certainly necessitate locks. The canal itself would run from the Caribbean along the route of the Chagres River as far as the center area here. The Chagres River again goes up here into the mountains, and then there's a much higher area of ground here which would have to be excavated to enable the canal to run through to the Pacific coast at Bilbao and Panama City. Here is the Chagres River now as it enters the canal. But in those days it was a very stormy current, and during the rainy season it was very hazardous to boats. The tropical rainforest would represent another hazard to the canal workers because of the presence of venomous animals, snakes and insects, spiders, as well as diseases like yellow fever and malaria. And the death rate once the construction started during the de Lesseps period was over 200 a month. Here we can see the cut that was subsequently made through the higher ground, and this would require a considerable amount of excavation to complete the construction of the canal. The French effort ultimately went bankrupt and over 20,000 lives were lost. And it also wiped out the savings of upwards of 1 million French investors. There was also corruption scandals associated with it, and both De Lesseps, his son, and Eiffel of Eiffel Tower fame were found guilty of misappropriation of funds. So effort after the effort ultimately of de Lesseps collapsed. In the 1890s, the USA started to become interested and decided to purchase for 40 million US the assets and rights of the French company that had taken over the project after the failure of de Lesseps' venture. And in 1902, the US passed the Spooner Act that agreed the purchase of the assets that had been left by this French company. And this also included the railway. I shall say a bit more about the railway in a later part of the talk. So there was also an apocryphal story at this time that a letter was sent from proposals for a canal in Nicaragua. The idea would be that it would run using this lake from the Pacific here and across to the Caribbean, thinking that this lake would facilitate the construction of the canal, especially with this river that runs down here to the Caribbean coast. But the apocryphal story is that the letter that was sent to Washington had a stamp on it with a volcano, and there are a lot of volcanoes along this stretch of the Pacific coast of Nicaragua, and seeing the volcano on the stamp, the officials in Washington thought that that wasn't a very good place to try and build a canal, so Panama was selected. The geology in Panama is different and doesn't contain any volcanoes in the area where the canal was to be built. So from that point of view, it was a much preferred site. Another issue that arose was that Panama at this time here, the area of Panama, was an integral part of Colombia. And the US made a proposal to the Colombian government to purchase the land and lease the land on either side of the canal. But although it was agreed in principle, the government in Bogota did not ratify it. And so the issue lapsed. And therefore, the US had the decision maybe they could persuade Panama to the authorities, the the landowners and so forth in Panama to break away from the Bogota government and form an independent country, which then the US could deal with and persuade to their terms as far as leasing the land and constructing the canal. At this time, Theodore Roosevelt, had just become president, and he finally signed this. He was associated with the initial treaty with Colombia, and the agreement was that they would have a permanent lease and pay 10 million a year for it, and also annual rental payment. However, as I've explained, as the Colombian government didn't ratify it, he was associated now with this scheme to split Panama from Colombia. And so, as I said, he then got involved in this scheme to break Panama away from Colombia. And he agreed to support the revolt in Panama with troops and money. And with this support, Panama became independent and agreed to allow the US to build and administer indefinitely the canal. This agreement became a contentious diplomatic issue both in Panama and Colombia for many years afterwards, which is hardly surprising. And here's a cartoon of the time showing Teddy Roosevelt here. Here is Colombia, and the egg of Panama has come out of the egg of Colombia. And here is a spear, as it were, from the US with bagloads of money persuading Panama Canal to break off. So this was an example of gunboat diplomacy, US style. So this is the chosen route here across, and as I said, this side is quite hilly, has to be excavated, and then the Chagres River on the Atlantic coast. So the US agreed to pay this Panama protectorate, as it became, 10 million and 250,000 US every year. And here's the route again, as we've seen before. We've got the Chagres River here, and then we have the cut over the Calabria cut, as it's now known as, on the Pacific side. Initially, the project was started in 1904, and it was run by the US government under a commission called the Isthmian Canal Commission, which was very bureaucratic and difficult to deal with. And initially, John Wallace, who was a railroad engineer, was appointed to run the project, but he resigned after a year, overwhelmed by the disease-plagued country, the scale of the works, and the bureaucracy of this canal commission. So he was succeeded by John Stevens, who was another railroad engineer, and he built the Great Northern Railroad through the Rockies. This runs from Chicago, Minneapolis to Seattle in Washington State, and was a pretty tough civil engineering assignment. And Roosevelt obviously felt he had the strength of mind and character to drive this project forward. He insisted on dealing directly with the government and not with the ICC, and he improved the infrastructure, living accommodation, workshops, repair yards, and the railroad, which had been taken over by the US, and it was, of course, obviously needed to remove a lot of the spoil produced during the excavation of the cut. Sanitation measures, window screens and mosquito nets were introduced, and measures were taken to eliminate the sites where mosquitoes could breed, to support the theory at that time that yellow fever and malaria were mosquito-borne diseases. Nevertheless, 5,000 workers died during construction. And here we can see a plan of the canal. Initially, it was planned to be a sea level canal, but William soon realised that this was quite unrealistic owing to the huge amount of excavation required, and so instead his plan was to have 3 locks at the Atlantic end to produce a huge artificial lake, which became known as the Gatun Lake, and then fill up the cut when it had been made, and then 3 locks on the Pacific end to bring the shipping back to sea level. So that was his plan, but you get an idea of the amount of excavation that was needed during this construction of the cut. And here is some of the machinery that was used at the time. These huge steam shovels were shipped out to Panama to assist in the excavation. The existing railroad was upgraded to move the spoil, and labour was recruited in the US and in the British West. And here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt himself, who visited the construction during his presidency, sitting on one of these huge steam cranes. Roosevelt did not live to see the completion of the canal, as after his term expired in 1910, he went on an expedition to South America and succumbed to various diseases, and he didn't survive long after that expedition. Here we can see what was involved in constructing what was known at the time as the Galliard Cut, which is known today as the Calabria Cut. In 1907, Stevens resigned, and Roosevelt determined that the next engineer he appointed would be someone who could not resign, and so he appointed Major George Goethals of the US Army Corps of Engineers, who had experience of canal building, and Goethals did in fact see the project out to its conclusion in 1914. Here gives an idea of the scale of excavations required. And of course the hardware, as it were, the lock gates and so on, all built in the States, probably in Pittsburgh, and shipped out to the site. Here we see the Gatun lakes, the Gatun locks. These are the locks at the Atlantic end, the Caribbean end, under construction. And here we see them as they are today. And as you approach the canal, you can see how the locks and the breakwater that's made that you tie up alongside as you go into the canal. And the line from the ship is thrown down onto the sea here and is captured by these two guys in this boat and tied up to locomotives that run along the track and keep the ship central in the lock as it goes to line. And these are the locomotives that are used to attach the lines to the ship to make sure that the ship does not rub along the side of the lock and sail through on its own steam. It's not pulled by these locomotives, they just keep it in position. The first ship to go through in 1914, the San Cristobal, and what an achievement that was. In the back, you can see this huge lake, this Lake Gatun, which was created as part of the canal's construction and took 2 years to fill from the water from the Chagres River. And here you see the line of the canal and the size of this Lake Gatun, a quite enormous lake, which you sail through, having gone through the Gatun locks. And here's the part of the cut going through to the west. The actual Gatun Lake is 470 square kilometres in size, and it provides the water for the operation. And obviously, every time a ship goes through, a lot of water is required each time a ship passes through. The canal itself is 77 kilometres, 48 millimetres long. In 1921, the US agreed to pay Colombia 25 million US and make 5 payments of 5 million and guarantee Colombia special privileges relating to the canal. In return, Colombia recognized Panama as an independent nation. So in a sense, the US here used the almighty dollar to pay off Colombia for its annoyance at having lost Panama as a result of US policy in the early 1900s. In the 1920s, a dam was built across the Chagres River here, and this controlled the flow of water into Lake Gatun and the operation of the canal, and also a hydroelectricity facility was also included in the construction, and this provided power for the operation of the canal. In 1962, this Bridge of the Americas was completed, and that facilitated movement of traffic across the canal at the Pacific end. And this aerial view of the Pacific end of the canal shows Panama City here, and the Bridge of the Americas here that I've just referred to, and the Miraflores locks are just up here. The new canal for the larger ships runs down in this direction, and wasn't there when this photograph was taken. One of the largest ships to go through the canal was this USS Missouri battleship, Iowa-class battleship, which went through in 1945 during the Pacific War, and obviously it was built with a view to be able to go through the canal so it could operate in both the Atlantic and Pacific theatres. The size of ship that can pass through the locks of the Panama Canal are referred to as Panamax size, and they are 300 by 32.6 by 12 meters in size. Approximately 200,000 cubic meters of water is lost per ship's passage through the canal. After World War II, there was increasing pressure from the Panamanians to hand over the canal and its facilities to Panama, especially after NASA had nationalized the Suez Canal. Ultimately, in 1977, President Carter signed a treaty with Panama agreeing to hand over the land and the canal to Panama on the 31st of December 1999, and this was actually done during Bill Clinton's presidency. Before the handover, a contract to operate the container ports at Colón here, and also down here at Panama City, control of these container terminals was awarded to Hutchinson Whampoa, which is a Hong Kong-based company that's experienced in managing and running container terminals. The tolls that are charged or were charged in 1916 give an indication of the potential income to Panama for ships' passage and use of the canal, but a freighter of average size would have to pay a toll of 400,000 US, depending of course on its size and the number of container units that it carries. Cruise ships are charged according to the number of berths, and the average charge again will be about 200,000 US. Smaller ships up to 800 US, and a certain Richard Halliburton, who in 1928 swam the canal, still had to pay 36 cents. You would think they might have awarded him a freebie, but the American authorities weren't feeling very generous at that time, obviously. The average time for passage of a cruise ship is about 8 hours, whereas a freighter 20 to 30 hours. And the transit tonnage has gone up, as you can see, over these figures, 2003 up to the last figures I have here, 2015, 340 million tonnes. More recent developments included an agreement between Nicaragua and a Hong Kong-based company, HKND, to develop a canal in Nicaragua. This was on the line that I mentioned earlier, which had been suggested to the American authorities before Panama site was selected. This maybe stimulated the Panama authorities to enlarge the size of the canal by putting in a second set of locks at both ends, which were wider and deeper, straightening the Culebra Cut, deepening the channel in Lake Gatun, and improving the depth at the Atlantic and Pacific outlets, and improving the water supply at a budgeted cost of 25 billion US. This project was completed in June 1916 by a Belgian contractor, Jan de Nul, who unfortunately still sought an extra 3.4 billion US because the cost of the project had overrun. We're not clear whether they've achieved this payment or what agreement's been made. This is the site where the Hong Kong company might have built a canal, but nothing more has been heard from them since this announcement. This is an aerial picture showing the site of the Gatun locks and the original canal, and here is the site of the new larger locks at the Caribbean end. And
Panama Canal celebrates 100th anniversary. The expansion of the Panama Canal, aimed to be completed by June 2015, will open up the 81-kilometer channel to even bigger vessels. The canal currently uses locks to raise ships 26 meters above sea level. Water from the artificial lake enters by gravity into locks and causes ships to rise. The ships then travel through the artificial lakes and channels until they reach the locks to the sea on the other side. 2 new sets of locks are being constructed to supplement the already existing locks at the Atlantic and Pacific entrances of the channel. The new locks will be larger but use less water than the existing ones. Nearby basins will recycle the water from the locks as they are emptied and use the water to partially fill the locks when another ship passes through. Water from the canal's lakes will also be used to fill the locks. The new locks will be able to handle ships that are longer, taller, and wider. Per ship cargo capacity will nearly triple, from the current roughly 4,500 standard container limit to roughly 12,000 standard containers. These changes will make the Panama Canal more competitive with the alternative Suez Canal route, which currently accommodates much larger ships.
Here is a picture of a ship, a natural gas carrying freighter, coming into one of the larger locks. Apparently they use a tug system here, not using the locomotives that I've described on the original locks. Now moving on to talk a little bit about the railway. This predated the canal by about 50 years because in 1848 a William Aspinall, who operated the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and he after the discovery of gold in California, there was a huge rush of immigrants wanting to cross the Isthmus of Panama as a quick way to get to California for the gold rush. And so in 1849, he was chosen, William Aspinall, as head of the Panama Railroad Company. And in 1850, the owner of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company bought an option on land here at the at the Caribbean end and the mouth of the Chagres River. And there they built harbour facilities on an island which was known as Manzanillo Island, which is now occupied by the city of Colón at the Caribbean end of the railroad. The island, which they call Aspinall, was a treacherous and marshy island covered with mangroves, so the conditions for building a railroad were extremely hazardous. That's the site of the island. It had to be connected to the mainland by track constructed across the sea and through dense tropical forests. At 1851, after 20 months, only 8 miles of track had been laid, but they were able to provide a passenger service from the docks to the Chagres River, providing some income. By 1852, 23 miles of track had been laid, and the first bridge over the Chagres River was washed away, and another iron bridge 91 metres long was built, and that is still in place today. In all, 170 big bridges and culverts had to be built, so it was a very big construction for the 1850s railroad engineers. The project was completed in January 1855 when the first train passed through from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the line was eventually upgraded to double track 5-foot gauge. It cost $8 million US, and until the canal opened, it carried the largest tonnage of freight on any railway and was the most profitable in the world. It is estimated that between 5,000 and 10,000 workers died in its construction. The railway played obviously a major role in the building of the canal and had to be rerouted around Lake Gatun, and it was taken over by the US government as part of the building of the canal, and obviously was very important in moving spoil which had been excavated during the construction. After the canal was returned to Panama in 1999, the railway was purchased by Kansas City Southern Railroad, a Class 1 U.S. freight line, and was upgraded to U.S. railroad standards. A single track to standard gauge 4 foot 8.5 inches was built on concrete sleepers. New locomotives and rolling stock were purchased. It connects container terminals at both ends, Atlantic and Pacific, as well as running a passenger service. And here is the line from Colon here across Lake Gatun and then runs very close to the canal through here down to Panama City. Here's a picture of the track, and you can see the loading gauge here, which facilitates double stack container wagons to run through on this line. Here we have a picture of the passenger train, which runs back and forth every day, taking about an hour for the journey. And here we have a freight train. You can see some double stack containers there. And this is another freight train on the line. And this is the Gamboa Bridge over the Chagres River, which was built originally, as I said, in the initial construction in the 1850s and is still there today. This is the Pacific Container Terminal, and there is a similar one at the Atlantic end. And here we see a double stack container train running through the double stack container train on the line. Now I'm going to take you on an imaginary journey through the canal from the Caribbean end, and here we're entering the Caribbean end of the canal. These two columns are sites of a new bridge which is being built at the Atlantic end of the canal as part of the enlargement of the locks, which are situated over here, whereas the alongside the Gatun locks, which are more or less straight ahead. And here we see the Atlantic Road Bridge a year later, and the construction has proceeded a lot further, and I'm sure now that that bridge is open and fully operational. And we're approaching now the Gatun locks. Here we're coming alongside, and this is the boat. There will be one of these on the other side collecting two lines from our bow, which then ties us in to the breakwater here and connects us up to the locomotives, which keep us in the middle of the locks when we get into the locks. Here they're collecting the line, and obviously before we can get into a lock, the lock has to be emptied down to the sea level, and then this is what's going on here from this lock here on the other side. This is again one of the lock gates, and here's the old method of crossing the canal here with the traffic backed up here, waiting to get across here when the lock gates are closed. Here the locomotives are keeping this oil tanker in the right position going through the canal, the lowest Gatun lock. And normally on a ship of this size there are 6 locomotives, 3 on each side, 2 towards the front and 1 at the stern. As I said, the ships go through under their own power, and you can just see the water here at the stern of this ship being churned up by the ship's propellers. The locomotives are operating on a rack and pinion system which facilitates their ascent up this very steep slope from one lock level to the next. You can imagine in the days of steam locomotives that the amount of steam and smoke that would be involved in a locomotive making that ascent would be a very significant feature in a passage of the canal. We have just gone through the Gatun locks here, and we're now in Lake Gatun, and looking towards the Caribbean we can see the enormous size of this lake. Alongside the Lake Gatun are remains of the tropical rainforest, which of course originally would have covered the whole area prior to the construction of the canal. This crane is based at the maintenance depot in the middle of the canal. There's a story about this crane. Apparently it was built in Germany. It was delivered to the canal in 1914, but was never actually paid for because by the time the crane had arrived and been delivered, Germany was involved in the First World War, and by the end of the war, the company that constructed it no longer existed. So the US Canal Company, got a freebie. Well, that's the story that they tell you when you go past this crane. Here we see the entrance of the Chagres River into Lake Gatun. Of course, the water from the Chagres River filled Loch Gatun. It took several years to do so. And here we have the railway and the bridge that was built as part of the initial construction of the railway, and it was obviously work has to go on continually to try and reduce the risks of soil erosion blocking the canal and reducing the draft. So it's a continual effort. Here we're entering the Calibri Cut, and we see here the Centennial Bridge, another bridge built in the 1980s. The Calabri Cut has been straightened as part of the enlargement work on the canal to facilitate larger ships going through. Here we see this rather large hill here, which obviously had to be excavated, had to be cut back in this way to reduce the risks of landslip. And it was this hill and others that de Lesseps persuaded the French investors that these hills are full of gold, which of course they weren't, and but he told them this to keep their spirits up to fight. They were anxious as to where all their money was going without a canal being completed. Obviously, you can see the slopes again are reinforced here to reduce the risks of erosion and landslip. Now we're approaching Pedro Miguel Lock, which is the first lock on the Pacific end of the canal, and it's a single lock. And this route down here is the route that the route that we will take towards the Pacific end of the canal. And here we see the railroad. We see a freight train running along, going from Panama City to the Colon container terminal. And this is the passenger train. It takes roughly an hour from one end to the other. This is Miraflores Lock. This is the first, or the middle and lowest locks, the last two locks in the canal, the Pacific end. And this building here is a viewing area. You can have a day out from Panama City if you're a tourist, and there you can sit and watch the ships going through, and they serve you a slap-up lunch in the process. So it's probably a nice day out for tourists in Panama City. This is the container terminal at the Pacific end of the canal. This is the Bridge of the Americas, the first bridge that was built across the canal, and this is the Pacific Ocean, which we've nearly reached. And there, as a postscript, I read in June 2020, this Bluebell, a freighter, had a jammed rudder, and it ran into the railway bridge that crosses the Chagres River, which I showed you earlier on. And it was travelling at 7 knots, so it must have given the bridge quite a wallop. But apparently the line was restored in 16 days. Quite remarkable. So there we are. That's the conclusion of my talk. There's no doubt that the American effort to build the canal was an astonishing engineering achievement in the early 1900s. And I think it was one of the developments which put the US on the map of the world, a top country on the world, and probably was one of the first events in what we might now call the American century. That's the conclusion of my talk. Thank you very much.